Something that's come up occasionally on the discussion boards, which is interesting given that we're only in week 2, are some of the generic conventions with the works that we're reading. And while I've commented on it there, I think it is definitely worth addressing here. What do we call some of these stories? Broadly speaking, in the early 21st century, all of these fall under the rubric of horror. What precisely does that mean, particularly in light of the trend in specific literatures and film today towards overtly graphic, almost torture porn? If you think of things such as the Saw franchise or the Hostel franchise or any number of B slasher movies where gore, where simple carnage is preferable to actual fear, eliciting actual emotional and visceral responses from the audience, we can see the disconnect between horror as a catch-all universal genre and tales such as these. A distinction which might be helpful is going back to how the authors themselves would have classified their work. We get some impression of this looking at the title of the pulp magazines themselves. A good example of this is Weird Tales. While today it is called a horror magazine, it is precisely what the title says it is. It's devoted to weird tales. Not necessarily horror, not necessarily science fiction, not necessarily romance or thriller or mystery. Although if you look through the back catalog of Weird Tales, you will see all of these genres and many, many more amply represented. So, it's devoted to the weird, to the odd, to the uncanny, to that which is outside the purview of normal. And 90% of their back catalog would be classified, broadly speaking, as horror today. However, many of these stories and similar stories ran in other magazines with equally telling titles. Astounding Tales, Amazing Stories, Science Fiction and Fantasy. These are not, other than the last one, specific genres of writing today. However, in the time, they were considered to be broad categories. The Shadow Out of Time was first published in Astounding Tales. And yet The Shadow Out of Time is, at its heart, a horror story. But on a deeper level, it's simply a weird tale. It's something that kind of defies this broad genre categorization. And that's important. In the late 18th and early 19th century, horror was more visceral. It was considered more base. It didn't have the social cachet that it does today. So, Poe himself, going back to the 19th century, never really considered himself a horror writer. He wrote strange and dark tales, something much more in keeping with the Gothic tradition, something much more in keeping with the other 19th century American horror writers, such as Hawthorne, to a lesser extent Melville. Quite a bit of what Melville does, particularly in his short fiction, could be considered social horror. However, it's seldom categorized as such today, yet it has all of the elements that the 19th century would have associated with horror as a genre. So, these terms have shifted over time. The role of the supernatural. Is the supernatural a necessary element in these tales? Yes and no. Yes, in some of them, in that you're dealing with a cosmic mythos. You're dealing with what seems to be magic, and yet there are those today who would argue that magic is nothing more than science, which we do not understand. That's a very old debate in the field. But the supernatural elements, ghosts and goblins and strange creatures from beyond the grave, yeah, they're here. However, they're applied in a much different way than they tend to be today. Today, you scroll through Netflix, you'll see 300 zombie movies. Half of them have, the plague zombie base. It's an infection. You never see good voodoo zombies anymore. Why is that? Probably because of the scientific emphasis in our modern culture. However, in Lovecraft's day, voodoo zombies perfectly acceptable. Black magic, ritual sacrifice, all the good stuff of a good ghost story. Yeah, you're going to see that in a number of these tales. You're also going to see a lot of the modern, more scientific approaches to, well, what is magic? Well, it's science that the narrator can't explain, which leads to some awkward moments where, is this a tale about the supernatural? Is this a tale of supernatural science? Is this simply something else? That's why this is the Cthulhu mythos. There is a divine or magical element to quite a few of these tales. And yet science is never completely abandoned. It's hybridity. It's the use of both, not the exclusion, not the either-or dichotomy, which is very frequently presented in these genres today. Everything is much more relaxed. If it makes for a good story, okay, run with it. In certain corners, we're getting back to that a bit more today. We're seeing less emphasis in certain genres on the why does this work than what actually happens. How does this work? What does it actually do? What happens? And a lot of that is that authors today seem to be rediscovering two key elements which these authors knew very well. One, that plot exists to support character and mood. That's why these tales are extremely atmospheric. That's why there doesn't have to be an emphasis on blood and gore. Could Lovecraft and Company write this? Yeah. Have you read the original Psycho? Have you seen the film? The shower curtain stabbing scene? Yeah. They could write this. If you read Richard Matheson, who is a contemporary, near contemporary of Bloch's, and Clark Ashton Smith, they traveled in a lot of the same circles. Matheson can write gore when he has to. He chooses 9 times out of 10 not to, which reflects many of the sensibilities that we're seeing in the Lovecraft circle and in the stories which influenced the formation of the Lovecraft circle. Mood and atmosphere, character. Why do you trust the narrator? Why do you trust? Because of the voice. If you read The Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward, or The Statement of Randolph Carter, which is in week 6 reading, you trust Carter because of his voice, because of the imperative edge to it, because of the character that is presented, in spite of the bizarreness of the tale which he narrates. Much the same way we're tempted in Conrad's Heart of Darkness to trust Marlowe's narration. Even we know Marlowe is a liar. He says he abhors lying, and yet every indication there is that he is an inveterate liar. But we want to trust him, just like we want to trust Randolph Carter. because plot exists to support character and mood. The second thing is that plot cannot exist without character and mood. That's why so many are disenchanted with horror as a genre in many aspects today. Because in many cases, the emphasis on the gore, the emphasis on how creatively can we kill the maximum number of characters, the plot points like that override the development of characterization, the development of atmosphere, the development of mood. Meanwhile, here, both are very smoothly integrated. Therefore, they don't need gore. Or when it is necessary, and sometimes it is, even in Lovecraft, it's handled discreetly. It's almost like Greek tragedy, where the bloodshed occurs off stage and the audience is given a glimpse of the carnage, but is never fully presented with it. There's always mediation, there are always filters, there's always something to remove that kind of viscerality so that the other more important elements can bring about the same visceral effects. And it's all about the effect on the reader. How does the reader respond to it? Some of you will not be frightened of this. Some of you will not sleep. It depends on how you read it. It depends on how you personally respond to the tales. Personally, if you're reading every word and you're really understanding what's going on here, these are not nice stories. These are not calm, gentle fairy tales. And even the densest, most didactic prose has a nugget of raw terror, which is the way it should be, in my humble opinion. So, the difference between science fiction, the weird tale, and modern horror, and what do these stories actually do? Hopefully this has addressed some of your major concerns that you're posting on the discussion boards. I will update with subsequent video lectures as needed and try to cover similar points as we have to discuss them. If you come up with anything that you would like to see discussed in a subsequent video lecture, please let me know. Post it on the discussion board, shoot me an email. If you're having problems or concerns about certain elements of the text, let's talk. That's what I'm here for. Enjoy the readings and keep in touch.